The smell I remember most is Tim Hortons coffee going cold in the cup holder. My aunt had picked one up at the drive-thru before we left, and by the time we pulled onto the Trans-Canada, she hadn't touched it once. That's how I knew something was wrong. My aunt always drinks her coffee before it gets cold. Always. I was 31 years old when I found out my entire life had been built on a lie. But to understand what happened that March, I need to take you back to the morning my mother called me into the kitchen and told me to sit down. I had driven out to her place in Guelph for what I thought was an ordinary weekend visit. She'd sounded strange on the phone the week before, clipped, careful, like she was measuring every word before she let it out. I put it down to stress. She'd been dealing with some health stuff. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself that a lot when it came to my mother. She had made tea, which she only does when she's nervous. The kettle was already on the counter when I walked in, still steaming. She didn't hug me at the door the way she usually does. She just said, "Come sit down, Lena," and walked back to the kitchen ahead of me. My name is Lena Calloway. I'm 34 now. What I'm about to tell you is the truest thing I've ever said out loud. I sat at that kitchen table, the same one I'd eaten 10,000 bowls of cereal at as a kid, the same one where I'd done my homework, where I'd cried after my first real heartbreak, where my mother and I had eaten Christmas dinner every year for as long as I could remember, just the two of us. And my mother told me that the man I had believed to be my father since birth was not my father. She said it plainly. Not cruelly, but plainly, the way you say something when you've been rehearsing it so long that the emotion has worn smooth. She told me that my biological father was a man named Arthur Brennan, that they had been together when she was 22, that she had loved him, that she had found out she was pregnant and told him, and that he had told her he wanted to be part of our lives. And then she had met someone else. A man with a good job, a house in the suburbs, a future that looked stable and solid from the outside. And she had chosen that instead. She had never told Arthur. She had simply stopped answering his calls, moved to a different city, changed her number. Let him believe she had miscarried, because a mutual friend had passed that along without knowing it wasn't true. She had never told me. Not in 31 years. I sat there and I listened to all of it, and I didn't say a single word. I couldn't. My mouth had stopped working. My hands were flat on the table and I was staring at the grain in the wood. Like if I looked at it hard enough, it would make sense of what was happening in the room around me. When she finished, she slid a piece of paper across the table. A name and a phone number, handwritten. She said Arthur had reached out to her lawyer 6 months ago. That he had never fully let go of looking. That he had hired someone a few years back to quietly trace what had happened to her, and that eventually the picture had become clear enough that he'd gone the legal route. She said she'd thought about not telling me. She said she'd gone back and forth for months, but in the end, she'd decided I deserved the choice. I picked up the piece of paper. I folded it in half without looking at the number, and then I said the only thing I could think of. I said, "Does he know about me?" And she said, "He's known for about 8 months. I left her house that afternoon without finishing my tea. I drove back to my apartment in Hamilton, and I sat in the parking garage for 45 minutes without getting out of the car. Not crying. Not thinking, exactly. Just sitting with the weight of it. The specific heaviness of learning that the story you've been living inside isn't the story that actually happened. The man I'd grown up calling my father. My mother's second husband, the one with the house and the stable job, had left when I was 9. He'd moved to BC, started over, sent birthday cards until I was about 12, and then stopped. I had never had the kind of father who showed up. I had grown up understanding, at some point, that I was not a priority to him. I had made my peace with that, or something that looked like peace from the outside. But this was different. This was the knowledge that there had been someone else, someone who hadn't known I existed, someone who had been looking. I didn't call the number that week, or the next one. I put the piece of paper in the drawer beside my bed, and I went to work every day and came home and cooked dinner and watched television and tried to feel normal. I talked to my best friend about it once, briefly, and then changed the subject because I couldn't hold the conversation without feeling like the floor was tilting under me. It was my aunt who finally sat me down. She's my mother's older sister, and she's always been the person in my family who says the thing no one else will say. She called me 3 weeks after my mother's confession and told me she'd heard what happened and that she wanted to take me for a drive. I said I was fine. She said she wasn't asking. We ended up at a Tim Hortons off the highway, sitting across from each other at a small table near the window, both of us with our hands wrapped around cups we weren't really drinking from. And she told me she'd known. Not everything, but enough. She'd known that Arthur Brennan had existed. She'd known that my mother had made a choice she'd later struggled to live with. She told me she had pushed my mother for years to say something, and that my mother had always found a reason not to. Then she looked at me and said, "He lives in Nova Scotia now, he's been there a long time, and Lena, I think you should go." I looked at her. She said, "I think you'll regret it if you don't." I drove home that night and opened the drawer beside my bed and unfolded the piece of paper for the first time since my mother had handed it to me. I didn't sleep. At 6 in the morning, I booked a flight to Halifax. I don't entirely know why. Maybe because my aunt had said it out loud and made it real. Maybe because I'd spent 3 weeks pretending the drawer wasn't there and it wasn't working. Maybe because some part of me that I hadn't been listening to was already decided. I texted Arthur Brennan's number before I got on the plane. Just one line. I said my name was Lena Calloway and that I believed we might be related, and that I was going to be in Halifax the following morning if he was willing to meet. I landed at Stanfield just after 10. It was raining the way it rains in Halifax in March. Sideways, cold, the kind of rain that finds the gap between your collar and your scarf, no matter how careful you are. I picked up my rental car and sat in the airport parking lot with the engine running and my phone in my lap, reading the message he'd sent back. He'd replied within 40 minutes of my text. He said, "I know who you are. I've been hoping you'd reach out. I'll be wherever you want me to be. You set the terms." I had read that message 17 times on the plane. I read it again in the parking lot. You set the terms. 4 words that told me more about a person than a lot of people managed to communicate in years. I wrote back the name of a coffee shop near the waterfront. He said he'd be there at noon. I got there 20 minutes early. I sat at a table by the window and watched the rain move across the harbor and tried to calm something in my chest that had no name. I'd looked him up, of course. In the weeks since my mother's kitchen, I'd looked him up more than I wanted to admit. He was 63. He had a daughter from his marriage, a girl about 10 years younger than me. He ran a small marine equipment business in Dartmouth that had apparently been going for over 2 decades. His Facebook profile was sparse and hadn't been updated in years, but there was a photo from a fishing trip with his brother, and I had stared at that photo for a long time. His eyes, something around the jaw. I knew what I was looking for, and I didn't let myself say it out loud. He walked in at noon exactly. He was taller than I expected. He had the look of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors, weathered in a capable way, not a fragile one. He was wearing a dark jacket with a Stanfield's label peeking out at the collar, work boots, the kind of practical clothes that belong to a person who uses them. He stopped in the doorway and scanned the room, and when his eyes found me, he went very still for just a second. Then he walked over. He didn't reach out to hug me. He pulled out the chair across from mine and sat down and put his hands on the table and looked at me steadily, the way a person looks when they're trying to be present for something enormous, without making it about themselves. He said, "Thank you for coming. I know this couldn't have been easy." And I said, "I don't really know why I'm here." He said, "That's okay. You don't have to know yet." We talked for 3 hours. The coffee shop filled up and emptied out around us, and neither of us noticed. He told me about the years after my mother disappeared. The confusion, the grief, the mutual friend who delivered the news about the miscarriage, the way he'd eventually had to accept it and keep moving because there was nothing else to do. He'd met his wife, Rosemary, in his early 30s. They'd had their daughter, Claire. He'd built a life that was real and good and that he was grateful for. But there had always been something that wouldn't close. About 4 years ago, he said, he'd started to wonder. He didn't have a specific reason. Just a feeling that had been sitting in him for a long time that he hadn't been told the truth. He'd hired a private investigator. Felt ridiculous doing it, he said, but did it anyway. And what came back had taken another year to fully understand, and another year after that to figure out what, if anything, to do about. He said he'd approached my mother's lawyer carefully. He said he hadn't wanted to blow anything up. He just wanted her to know that he knew, and that he thought I deserved the right to make my own choice. I asked him why he hadn't just found my contact information and reached out directly. He had it by then. I know he did. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I didn't want to be the person who walked into your life without warning and turned it upside down. I thought that should be your mother's choice to make. Even if I didn't trust her to make it." I sat with that for a while. I asked if his wife knew. He said yes, that Rosemary had known everything since the beginning of the investigation. I asked how she'd felt about it. He smiled a little and said, "She told me I'd never sleep again if I didn't at least try." I asked about Claire. Whether she knew she might have a half-sister. He looked at me carefully and said Claire had known for about 3 months that she was nervous, but that she wanted to meet me if I was ever open to it. That she'd asked him not to push. I looked out at the harbor. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. A container ship was moving slowly across the gray water toward the Narrows, taking its time. I said I grew up thinking I wasn't important enough to stay for. The man who raised me's left, and it was like I hadn't made enough of an impression to make staying worth it. And I made my peace with that. I genuinely think I did. But then my mother tells me there was someone else. Someone who looked. Someone who actually wanted to know where I went. My voice did something in that last sentence that I hadn't planned on. I pressed on, and I don't know what to do with that. He didn't rush to fill the silence. After a moment he said, I can't undo what was taken from both of us. I wouldn't insult you by pretending I can. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere unless you tell me to. I flew back to Hamilton 2 days later. I had gone for coffee and stayed for 2 days, walking around Dartmouth with a man I'd just met who shared my jawline, meeting Rosemary in their kitchen over a proper East Coast supper of fish chowder and fresh bread, sitting across from a daughter who looked at me with eyes that were measuring curious, and, underneath all of that, quietly hopeful. Claire and I had talked for 2 hours on the back deck the second evening, wrapped in fleece blankets against the March cold, both of us drinking tea we kept forgetting. She was 22. She was studying environmental science at Dahl. She had strong opinions about recycling programs, and a very specific sense of humor that caught me off guard and made me laugh harder than I expected. At one point she said, without looking at me, I always wanted a big sister, and then immediately looked mortified that she'd said it, and I told her not to apologize. On my last morning in Dartmouth, Arthur made breakfast. Nothing elaborate: eggs, toast, back bacon, orange juice, the ordinary machinery of a household morning. He put a plate in front of me and poured coffee without asking, and then sat down across from me with his own, and we ate together in the kind of quiet that isn't uncomfortable. The kind that's built. Before I left, I asked him the thing I'd been building up to for 2 days. I asked why, after the investigator confirmed what had happened, he hadn't walked away from it. He had a full life. A wife who loved him. A daughter. A business that needed him. He could have closed the file and moved on, and no one would have blamed him. He set his coffee mug down and thought about it honestly, which I appreciated. He didn't reach for a clean answer. He said, I grew up in a small town outside Antigonish. My dad left when I was 7. My mother worked nights at the mill and we didn't have much, but she was there. She was always there. And I think somewhere in me I decided early that if I ever had a kid, I was going to be the kind of father who shows up. And then I thought I'd lost the chance, and when I found out I hadn't, that somewhere out there you were real, and you were grown, and you'd gotten this far without any of this, I couldn't just leave it alone. It would have meant something about the kind of person I was that I didn't want to be true. I've thought about that answer almost every day since. I've thought about the word real. The specific weight of it. How he used it the same way you'd talk about something you'd believed in for a long time without being able to prove. The way you'd say, it was real, about something you'd been afraid wasn't. I am 34 years old now. I have a good job in marketing at a mid-sized firm in Hamilton. I have an apartment that I've lived in long enough to feel like mine. I have a best friend who has seen me through more than I can count, and a cat named Biscuit who destroys my houseplants systematically and without remorse. And I have a father. Not the man who left for BC when I was 9 and stopped sending birthday cards at 12. Not the absence I learned to fold into myself and carry. I have Arthur Brennan, who lives in Dartmouth and runs a marine equipment business and makes good coffee, and once drove 4 hours in a snowstorm to watch Claire compete in a regional debate tournament, the story of which I heard from Claire while we were sitting on that back deck in the cold. I have Claire, who sends me voice memos when something annoys her, because she says typing takes too long, who flew to Hamilton in September to spend a long weekend and left 3 of her hair ties on my bathroom counter, and a half-eaten bag of ketchup chips in my pantry, who FaceTimes me more than some of my friends I've known for 15 years. I have Rosemary, who texted me a recipe for that fish chowder 2 weeks after I left, because I'd mentioned it was the best thing I'd eaten in years. And I have my mother. My relationship with her is the complicated part, and I won't pretend it isn't. There are things I haven't fully forgiven yet. There are conversations we've had that led somewhere useful and conversations that ended with one of us hanging up too quickly. She made a choice at 22 that she carried alone for 3 decades, and whatever I think about that choice, the carrying of it cost her something too. I see that. I'm working on the rest. What I know is this. I grew up believing that people who mattered to you left eventually. That love had a shelf life, and when it expired, people moved on, and if you were unlucky, you were what they moved on from. I built a whole set of quiet defenses around that belief. Very neat, very functional, mostly invisible from the outside. And then I unfolded a piece of paper in a drawer at 6 in the morning and flew to Halifax in the rain and sat down across from a man who had been looking for me since before I knew he existed. I don't think my mother and the man I called my father meant to give me anything. I think they meant to close a chapter. What they actually did was leave a door slightly open, and Arthur was on the other side of it, and I was just stubborn enough, or desperate enough, or curious enough to walk through. If this story moved something in you, you are not alone. So many people carry the quiet weight of wondering where they came from, wondering if there's someone out there who wanted to find them. The truth doesn't always arrive gently, but sometimes it arrives exactly when you need it. If you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribe right now and hit the bell. Someone in your life might need to hear this today. Share it with them. We'll see you in the next one.